If y'all ready, we can go ahead and get started. Adam will not be here this week, so
Correct.
yeah. But see if I can share. There we go. Okay. So last week, I when I uploaded my thing to Canva to create my slideshow, it gave some weird like date, and I don't know if it was just from like a the template it was using had a date on it or a name. It was really weird, and so I don't know why it does that. So anyway, yeah, I realized it when I was last week watching the video. I was like, wow, Anyway, because it was like 2028, so it wasn't even a date close. So okay. Okay, guys. Well, we're going to begin looking at First Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9 through 10. This is technically the fifth Clobber Passage.
This meeting is being recorded.
The the first being Genesis 19, the second and third, second being Leviticus 18, third being Leviticus 20, I believe. Then last week, the fourth one was found in Romans 1. And so now we're looking in Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. And we're going to be talking, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but we're going to be talking about kind of the modern day assumptions based on the text. And that's basically what we've been talking about this whole time, is how modern Christianity, the way they've taken words that they didn't understand and kind of put these assumptions or these connections with those words. Saying that, the crazy thing is, I didn't just lose my screen share, did I?
Yes.
I don't know what just happened. No, that's not it. Okay, well, let me reopen Canva. Anyway, the crazy one of the crazy things to me, with here we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so one of the crazy things to me is the fact that so many of these passages we go back to the exact same story almost. We so many of these passages deal with the exact same things. Genesis 19, when we talked about it, we looked at issues of sexual violence, and like sexual exploitation. And that's what we find that was going on in the Canaanite countries in the time of Leviticus, especially in Babylonia, which when we read the stuff from Leviticus, we talked about how Leviticus passages were written, or it is believed that it was compiled in the time of the Babylonian Empire, the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people. And so, because of that, they were responding to what was going on in Babylon at the time. While Genesis 19 may have touched on that some because it was probably written down about the same time, but the Levitical chapters, they were responding directly to what was going on in Egypt and Canaan, as well as the Babylonian Empire. When we talked about Romans, we talked about the same thing. They were responding to what was going on during the Roman Empire, the city of Rome at the time. And Paul was writing to the Roman people, the Roman Christians, many of who were from Jewish or origination, but some of them were just Christians who were Roman, or they might have called Greek because they were Gentiles. But all of these passages are basically talking about something that was happening in that day and time. I hear a lot of Christians make comments about certain things in today's society that really have no connection to the biblical text, and they use these obscure passages to say well, this passage is talking about murder, and so because of that, we don't want to allow abortion and things like that. And when you look at the passage, it has nothing to do with what it is being related to in the modern 21st century. And because of that, each one of these passages that we've seen, they have been talking about some specific thing going on in the culture of the time. And we know that in the Roman and Greek cultures, they were very hypersexual. There was the Greeks, especially, there was a large amount of same-sex relationships, but it wasn't the modern concept. And so people will say things like, there were a lot of homosexuals in the Greek culture. Well, they didn't have a concept of a homosexual. There was no concept of a man falling in love with another man or being sexually attracted to another man. There was no, which the concept was there, but there was no exact, direct way of explanation. And so we can't say that there was a lot of homosexuals in the area of Greece because they didn't have the concept that we have of homosexuality. Instead, they were so focused on marriage, Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, they were so focused on the men having a wife that led to whatever this secondary relationship was, many times was exploited, whether it be younger individuals, like we talked about with the Romans, which the Romans actually had it was very common in the Roman Empire for the men to have young boys that were ages 12 to 17, young men, young adolescent age people. But we talked last week about how the Romans did not approve of pedophilia. They didn't approve of children, but they did allow the upper crust of society to have these male concubines that were between the ages of 12 and 17. People that were post puberty age or going through puberty age. And then those people would get kind of a quid pro quo is the only thing that I can think of to say it. They would have a relationship with this individual that the adult would give certain things to the young man, whether it be status in society, education. They would offer them certain rewards for the sexual acts that they would do, and then as they aged out, then they would have their own younger men that they would join with. And so there was this type of exploitation going on during the Roman Empire. And we see that a lot in the Greek Empire also, but the Greeks, that was prior to the Romans. So basically the way this looks is Leviticus and the books of the Pentateuch were probably written in the time of the Babylonian Empire, which was prior to the intertestamental period. After the Babylonians came Persians, and we find out about the stories of Daniel being during the Persian Empire. Much of Daniel was during the Persian Empire. Some of it was during the Babylonians. And then from Persians, there was a section of time that they were under their own rule, and then there was a section of time they were under Greek rule, and then finally in the New Testament we find them under Roman rule. And so there were all of these other cultures, and all of these cultures basically built on one another. So what was going on in the Babylonian time was also going on in the time of the Persians, the time of the Greeks, and ultimately in the time of the Romans. So many of these cultures, when they would build their empire, they would just accept everyone else and the way things were going and allow that to continue happening. And I know we've talked about that multiple times over the past few weeks, but I just kind of want to bring that out because, again, tonight we're going to see a lot of the same issues going on. So tonight we're going to continue our journey in the Clobber Passages. Each week we've taken a look at a passage that has been used to wound the LGBTQ plus people. And basically our purpose was to better understand what the true meaning of these passages have been. and compare it to the modern day concept of homosexuality and the modern day concept of mutual consent between two loving adults. Which that's been another one of the big issues that we've talked about is during the time of the Romans, during the time of the Greeks, during the time of the Babylonians, there was no consent. A lord, a person who had a higher rank, could take advantage of and humiliate these lower ranking people, whether they were slaves or just someone that was on a lower status. And because of that, they were allowed to do it. And so the writer of the biblical text, the writer of what we call the biblical text, was dealing with telling people that these things weren't right. This exploitation wasn't right. This taking advantage of and humiliation that was going on in the culture at that time is not good. So when we read 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, it says, "Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither will the immoral, the idolaters, the adulterers, the homosexuals, the thieves, the greedy, the drunkards, or revilers, or robbers will inherit the kingdom of God." Now, we talked the very first week. The word homosexual was not added to the English translation of the Bible until 1947. And it was actually added in the Revised Standard Version, the RSV, which is the text that we're reading tonight. And it's crazy that prior to that time, they found other words that they would use. Sometimes they would say things like pleasuring themselves with mankind. Sometimes they'd say things like effeminate. But these words, the word homosexual was never in the original English text until the 1940s, and it was in the Revised Standard Version. So because of that, it has caused great turmoil among the church and how they kind of added to their already preconceived ideas against gay people. And as we talked from the very first week, even the word homosexuality was not in the English language until the late 1800s, and its cognate in German didn't exist until the 1860s. So this word itself has such a new development that it's less than 200 years old. The actual concept, the way we think of as homosexuals, wasn't really studied and looked at by psychiatrists and psychologists except for the past 200 years. Prior to that, it was always a concept of some type of exploitation, a upper crust person having someone who was a slave or a servant or an individual in their life that was below them that they could manipulate into these sexual encounters. And so when we understand what was going on basically throughout history, it helps us to better understand why people had such a prejudice against homosexuality. Because it helps us to understand that it has always, in the eyes of the church, been something to do with exploitation, humiliation, sexual abuse, sexual assault. And that's what they saw for 1,000 years. From the time that the Bible was actually put together until after the Middle Ages. And even during the Middle Ages, there was this main push for men to be married. That was their goal. That was what they were told that they had to do. And so there wasn't a male-to-male consensual relationship that was completely two guys basically getting married and moving in together. It was always an extramarital type relationship outside of their marital relationship. And so that is what people saw for 1,000 years. And even longer than that, the time of the Babylonians were another 1,000 before that. And so that was basically where this concept that so many churches have today that has basically caused them to feel prejudiced against homosexuals. And I don't know. To me, I feel like that it doesn't give them the right to be prejudiced. However, it does explain for us kind of a better understanding on why so many people have been so focused on trying to use everything they could against homosexuals. And that has turned into this prejudice and I mean, anti-diversity. It's this thing that has developed that we have into the 21st century today. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and look at Corinth. So the city of Corinth was actually a Greek city. If you remember, Corinth was one of the main cities that Paul spent a lot of time in. Corinth was a port city. So it was filled with merchants. It was filled with sailors, people who were constantly traveling, constantly going. People who were coming in with their goods and would sell them at market and then leave and go buy more or get more, and then they would come back and they would sell. And so there was this constant opportunity of people coming and going. With that, because this was also in the Mediterranean Sea, so this was northern part of, well, Israel and what we think of as the Holy Lands, Palestine, and all of that area. This was north of that, north of Turkey, in the area of Greece. And there was a constant flow of people. Well, anywhere there's a constant flow of people, you're going to have two things. You're going to have the wealthy and you're going to have the impoverished. You're going to have the people that have a bunch of money, that are the wealthy merchants who are coming in, selling their goods and leaving to get more. And then you're going to have the people that are living day to day, barely having enough food to live on that day, and going and having to scrounge for food and see if they can find a place that they can work for money. And if not, they're finding other ways to get food. And so there was this completely different polistic society where you have one pole that is the wealthy, one pole that is the impoverished, and then you had the people in between that were just trying to live their lives. And so because these existed side by side, it was very easy for the wealthy to force power and force domination over this lower part of society. They would take them in as servants, they would take them in as slaves. Many of them would be treated as like male consorts, where they were outside of their marriage. They would have their marriage to a woman, but then as an extra relationship, they would have this guy that they would have sex with on the side. And many times this was done for multiple reasons, to avoid having more children, because there are certain things that having a male sexual partner gives you that having a female partner doesn't. And so Paul was talking to this very complex world. And it was divided by class. It was also divided by culture. You had the Greeks, who had what we call a Hellenistic culture, who believed in the Greek deities. You had the Romans that lived in that area because Rome was the empire of the time. And there, while the Greeks were more sensual in their beliefs, the Romans were more about dominion and forcing things and assault. And then you had the Jews that were slowly filtering that direction in the time of Paul, because they had been separated. They had been sent out from the area of Jerusalem. And so there were all of these different people that were converging in the area of Greece, especially in Corinth, because of where it was located, and it was this bustling port city. Then you also had the people that were sailors and soldiers that were constantly coming and going, and a lot of times these individuals were with a group of men the entire time. That was all they hung out with, because they were sailors, they lived on a boat, or they were soldiers and they lived in barracks with other soldiers. And so there was a lot of difference between what we see in the 21st century today to what we see in the time of Paul under Roman rule in the area of Corinth. Now, because their understanding of sex had more to do with status and not intimacy, there were a lot of people that were forced into these sexual relationships. And so there was exploitation, there was power struggles between people, and typically these high lords would force sex on the people under them because to them it was okay to force someone who didn't make as much money as you in these what they felt like were humiliation roles. It was never anything to do with consensual, intimate sexual relationships. Instead, it was entirely to do with forcing individuals outside of their own able to consent to have sex with people who were more wealthy, people who were from the upper crust of society. And this is what the church was struggling with. The church was struggling with the spiritual nature of the people, the fact that you had some of the cities that Paul visited had these people who would create these idols, golden idols and silver idols, and that was how they made their money. And so there was a lot of spiritual competition in the church, people who wanted to serve their idols, their Greek gods, their Roman gods, but then also wanted to serve the God of the Jews and the God of Christianity. And it was just a bunch. There was a lot of stuff going on at this time. And so Paul was writing to this society. And if you ever have read through the book of Corinthians, there was a lot of sexual things going on. There was a young man who was with his father's wife. It's believed probably his stepmother. There were other sexual issues going on in the time that Paul was speaking out against. And so what we read in this passage is just something that he's bringing up in a long list of other things. And in that list, he mentions things like theft, being a drunkard, going out and causing trouble. He mentions the greedy. He mentions people who were robbers. So instead of just theft, stealing, they were forcing their theft. They were like armed robbery type things. Idolaters. And then he mentions this word just immoral. And so in that, we're going to look at a couple of these words to better understand what they meant in that day and time. So, let me get to my slide. Okay, so Paul's letter, in his letter, he was writing the book of Corinth, or the letter to the Corinthian church, talking about community restoration. It all came back to this issue of trying to help them bring a connection between the community and the church. People, it never was meant to be a sexual manual or sexual ethics. He was talking about a fractured community, whether it be the community in the church or the community outside the church. But he was talking in a way to try to bring a connection between these groups of people. And with that, he uses a couple of words. The first word is malakoi. And basically this word means soft ones. It means an individual who has a soft nature. Now, it is often translated by some modern day translators as homosexuals. But the word itself simply means an individual who, it refers to an individual who is morally weak, or an individual who is self-indulgent. Now, many times it was used to talk about the passive role in the exploitative sexual system. So the passive sexual role, not the active sexual role. And so he's talking about these individuals who were prostitutes, who were the young men who were taken advantage of by these older, more wealthy men, and the men who allow themselves to be used sexually in power dynamics. It was never meant to talk about a gay individual who is giving themselves over to another individual that they're in love with, that they have intimacy with. It was never meant to talk about someone who was simply in a loving relationship that was consensual. Instead, it was always meant in every type of writing, both in the Bible and in extra biblical texts, it was talking about individuals who were being exploited, whether it be the prostitute or the young man, whoever it was. The next word that we see is arsenokoitai. And this word unlike being just considered soft ones, this word is actually extremely rare. It is not found in very many places at all. And it is believed that it was coined by Paul with the combination of two different words. Arson meaning male, and coitus or koitai meaning the bed. And we know we know that the particular Greek word for bed being used in the sexual nature is actually something that you still hear in certain areas where people will use coitus or it's still used, considered a sexual act, and it just simply means bed. The Greek compound word basically means a male bedder or a man of the bed, and it refers to specific behaviors. Now, again, this was something that they believe Paul put the words together. He coined it himself by just combining two words, creating this compound word. And it speaks of an economic exploitation through sexual act. Typically, while you have the soft one referring to the one who's being exploited, you had the arsenokoitai speaking of the person who was doing the exploitation. It was a form of sexual violence. It was a person who used the sexual slaves or used the temple prostitute. And again, it's a power struggle here. You have the soft one, the malakoi, being the receiver of this exploitation, and the arsenokoitai being the one who is forcing the exploitation. And typically it could mean either the active role or it could mean the person who is selling the prostitutes. There is no evidence anywhere in the biblical text or in extra-biblical text that arsenokoitai refers to any type of consensual sexual relationship. And because it was coined probably by Paul, and it's really only found in this one place in the Bible, there's not much evidence that we have anywhere else for us to be able to look at and say, okay, well, this was clearly a homosexual relationship. Instead, this is specifically talking about a person who is in power forcing sex on someone who is beneath them in society. And again, it was used in the RSV, translated as homosexuals in modern interpretation, but this was strictly a linguistic choice. It was not actually a way of them taking the two words and saying, this is what this word means. Instead, they just chose to use homosexuals because at the time they felt they had no other word to use. Now, because of that, it has been used, weaponized against the homosexuals of the modern century since 1946. Since the word itself was actually introduced in the English Bible, the church has said, well, if they're talking about homosexuals, then that means homosexuality has to be wrong. Before that, there was no reference of homosexual for this word or any other words in the Bible text. And because of the cultural view of the Christian church, they use this as a justification to have prejudice against homosexual individuals. And even prior to that, prior to the word homosexual being coined in the 1800s, even the word sodomite was not used in a homosexual relationship. It was used to talk about these men who were going out and having sex with other men while they also had their wife at home. And it, again, was talking about power and exploitation and forcing sex on someone who was lower class or lower society. And so Paul is bringing condemnation not on gay sexual intimacy, but on men who were exploiting other men for their own sexual desires. Paul's condemnation was not to destroy a community, but an exploitation that he saw among the people in power and the people that they were able to coerce and manipulate into these sexual relationships. It was never meant as mutual love, covenant partnership, or queer relationships. And even at that time, there was no concept of the LGBTQ identity, same-sex marriage, or healthy sexuality. It was strictly about power and control of someone who is a lower class than you. So before we go any further, does anybody have anything you want to say? I don't know. It looks like Anthony may have jumped out of here. So anyway, okay. So because of that, it's been misused because the church, or because the translators began using the word homosexual when they translated. And because of that, the church grabbed a hold of that and basically said, hey, we can use this. I mean, not logically, but this was how it worked. They began using that as a reason to condemn homosexuals and began using every passage from the Bible that they could find to actually try to condemn people who had a homosexual lifestyle. And because of this, we have 100 years of the church literally saying, well, the Bible says homosexuals, but they don't go back and look to see what the Bible really says, where Paul was really talking, what Paul was really saying in these passages. Instead, Paul, instead of talking about this type of loving relationship, he's talking about men who are forcing other men to have sex with them that was outside of their normal desire, outside of their normal longings. And whether it be the men who had the power that were leaving their normal natural desires to force on to other men, or the men who were being forced upon were not having a relationship with someone that they had a desire for, instead were being forced into bed with these individuals through violence and assault. And in many cases, it was a form of rape, a form of sexual violence against them. Okay, and so Paul uses this word, such were some of you. And again, many times the church has taken this phrase, such were some of you, to talk about the people in the church having homosexual identities, homosexual relationships, and they've used it to reject people in their own churches, in their own families. And it's basically become a, well, like we've said, it's become a weapon. That's probably the easiest way to say it. They've used this terminology, and such were some of you, just as a way to attack individuals they didn't agree with. And they go back and they look at these other things. Well, we don't agree with robbers, and so because of that, well, some of you were robbers, and so we don't like you because of that. We don't agree with people who were drunk, and so because we don't agree with drunkards, now we're going to turn our backs on those who are drunk, or who get drunk regularly, alcoholics, people like that. Murderers and adulterers and idolaters, we come against these individuals, and so they've used this passage to not only attack homosexuals, but other individuals. Sadly, things like adulterers, they don't cast them out of the churches like they do homosexuals. They don't cast the greedy out of the churches like they do homosexuals. They, to the best of my knowledge, don't cast alcoholics out of the church like they do homosexuals. And so Paul's wording here has been used by the church to attack basically one group of people, when there's this big long list of people that they could be attacking, but they choose not to. And in my opinion, I believe a lot of this has to do with the fact that to them, gay men, effeminate men, men who were playing the woman's role, has always been looked down upon by male, masculine dominated society. And so because of that, these men try to boost themselves up in their own masculinity, and they push away anyone that they can find that would have more of that passive role. And it has led to families falling apart. It has led to individuals being cast out of homes and cast out of churches. It has led to people treating individuals who they considered to not be as manly as not worth as much as people who were more manly. And it's become a major issue among these male-dominated churches, to where they no longer accept men that they feel do not make the same level of masculinity as they do. And it's all, in a lot of people, I believe this, it's all because of how they look at women and how they look at femininity. And they attack women because women are the weaker sex. They attack women because women shouldn't be leaders, or shouldn't be this, or shouldn't be that. And so if they attribute these men to having more feminine aspect, then they're going to treat them like they do the women. And it has really caused a lot of trauma in especially the sexual side, the homosexual side of culture, but it's also caused a lot of problems with just men who maybe felt like they didn't match up to these other men who were more manly and more masculine. And it all comes from a misunderstanding from the church looking at Paul's writings to the Romans, to the Corinthians, and then as far back as Leviticus and Genesis. I don't know. Again, we keep seeing this same thing come up. Every passage that we have that has been used to attack homosexuals is a passage dealing with this exploitation, this sexual violence. But not once did Paul ever say anything about a truly consensual, gay, intimate relationship. The Bible doesn't mention it. The Bible has no concept of that type of lifestyle. Instead, they're always focusing on the male sexual violence, the temple prostitution, and this relationship between men who were lords and masters over individuals who are below them, slaves and servants, and even people who they would humiliate in the modern day of their modern culture of their time. So, as awful as it sounds, that's basically what the Christians have come up with. They have used, so many churches have used these passages talking about exploitation and abuse and tried to use that to lump all homosexuals in. And the majority of homosexuals are not exploitative. They're not abusive. They're not power dominant. They're not trying to force sexual violence. That's something that they saw throughout history. And so now they tend to have this mindset that that's what every gay person is. And we know that that's not what homosexuality is. It's not about forcing power and forcing domination over someone. It's about love and intimacy and relationship building. And so Paul wasn't talking about loving relationships. Instead, Paul was trying to fight this injustice that had developed between the men of the higher classes against the men of the lower classes. And again, we're going to see that when we look at Timothy, that we're going to be dealing with the same thing. And it's an issue of justice and injustice, and not an issue of love and intimacy. And it's an issue of coercion. These men, they would find these younger men who were 12 to 17 years old and say, hey, we'll give you this really good education. We'll give you all of these riches. We'll give you this high place in society if you will come and let us do these things to you. And that's what Paul is speaking against. And that we're kind of done about 5 minutes earlier than what we normally are. But are there any other comments? I mean, I guess it's just the two of us, so there's really not a whole lot to talk about. But the main thing is, the one thing I'm really getting out of this is the fact that throughout history, that's what it's always been about. It's always been about this idea of exploiting one another for their sexual desires. And In every passage, that's what we see Paul talking about. That's what we see the writers of Leviticus talking about. It's trying to fight against exploitation and abuse. And it's been used by the church, weaponized against gay people for over 100 years. And so, I don't know. It's really sad that that's kind of it's sad that that is what they've taken and tried to place on the heads of homosexuals in modern society, whenever that's not at all what the Bible was talking about. Um, I mean, do you have anything to mention to that? Add to that? Any other thoughts?
No, I just think in a lot of cases, they look for a boogeyman,
And
in
you're
any
right.
case of anything going on to blame them for why things are the way they are. So,
Yeah, and that's exactly right. It's sad because they're going to do whatever they have to do to make the text say what they want it to say, to where they can find fault with certain people that they don't like.
and I
And
also found it interesting. I watched a little documentary thing last night about um, early homosexuality, and almost the same thing as you said. Until the 19th century, um, they weren't putting sexuality into boxes or anything. Everybody before then was just trying to survive, and there would be people in the society, and sometimes they were revered by some, and then sometimes they were just figured a way for them to fit into society, and sometimes there were places that cast them out, but there was no specific word for those people.
yeah, and even prior to the adding of the word homosexual in the text, the English text, the only other word that even came close was the word sodomite. But again, sodomite was only used to talk about the Old Testament temple prostitutes. It was never used in the passages that we're looking at. And because it was used to talk about the temple prostitutes, it again had to do with this abuse and exploitation of one class of people on another class of people.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And that stayed that way all the way through like the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. You still had these upper class people, these kings, lords, knights, these people that had authority, who were forcing that authority on people below them in the social chain.
Yeah, I mean, and that was the other thing that was kind of interesting in the point when they were talking, somewhat about homosexuality. They said, mostly in the past it was used by people to um, put their dominance over other, to
Mm-hmm.
display their dominance over other people. I'm a man, but I'm making this man to submit to me, and also to control people in society.
Yeah,
So it's really interesting from what you're saying and what I watched last night, and that it very much collates.
yeah. And I mean,
So,
that's like I said, that's what we're going to see all the way through the Book of Timothy. I mean, it all comes back to the same idea, and it's sad because that's really the only thing these passages have been talking about. Has been some form of sexual violence,
The recording has stopped.
and I don't know. Um, the modern day society, they don't want to admit that. They don't want to read it that way and look at it that way.
yeah. Well,
So
I mean, for them it's easy, and I mean, I can even think back earlier in younger passages or younger years when it first came up. I mean, I guess you just accept a lot of things that go on in the church,
hmm
and aren't questioning because you're young. And I mean, the church that I was brought up in, you didn't question.
no, no, you didn't.
I mean, you listened to what they had to say, and you tried to follow it, and you know be miserable. And if you thought differently, then you were sinning. So,
Yeah, exactly. So
all right. Well, have a good